All right, let's start with the big developments that are unfolding at the G7 summit, where the bilateral meeting between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and also US President Donald Trump has just come to an end. Now, US President Donald Trump, as a part of those talks, has finally now agreed that the Jammu and Kashmir issue is strictly a bilateral one. And with this, India, of course, continues to garner global support on the issue of Kashmir. And not only that, Donald Trump also went on to clarify his stand on Kashmir. He said that it was in fact best that the Kashmir issue is left for it to be handled bilaterally. Speaking of an earlier conversation, Donald Trump added that he had spoken to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who said that the Kashmir situation was pretty much completely under control. Listen in to what the two leaders said.
I'm here. I have a very good relationship with both gentlemen, and I'm here. If for any reason, but I think they can do it themselves very well. They've been doing it for a long time. Really feels he has it under control. I know they speak with Pakistan, and I'm sure that they will be able to do something that will be very good. I spoke about it last night as well.
And also, Trump's statement came after Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the issue should be handled bilaterally.
भारत और पाकिस्तान के सारे इश्यूज बायलैटरल है और इसलिए हम दुनिया के किसी भी देश को इनके लिए कष्ट नहीं देते हैं और मुझे विश्वास है कि भारत और पाकिस्तान जो 1947 के पहले एक ही थे, हम मिलजुल करके हमारी समस्याओं पर चर्चा भी कर सकते हैं और समाधान भी कर सकते हैं.
The Trump statement, of course, came after Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the issue will be handled bilaterally. Remember, Trump had in fact offered to mediate on the Kashmir issue not once, not twice, but thrice in the lead up to this G7 bilateral meeting. And this, despite India's strong opposition. This also comes as a major blow to Pakistan, which has been seeking to internationalize the Kashmir issue.
Which have shared democratic values, and we work for the welfare of the world, and whatever contribution we can make in whichever way, we have these common values, and we work.
All right, now to add more perspective in terms of what has unfolded at the G7 summit as the bilateral meeting took place between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and also US President Donald Trump, we are joined by strategic affairs analyst Professor Bramha Chellaney, who is joining us live on this broadcast on WION. Professor Chellaney, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this broadcast on WION. Let me begin by asking you this. So, President Donald Trump yet again spoke about the possibility of mediation in Kashmir, and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has made it abundantly clear that the issue strictly remains a bilateral one, and India would not want any other country to mediate on this issue.
I'm glad that Prime Minister Modi made it very clear in President Trump's presence that India views India-Pakistan issues as being strictly bilateral. He did not say Kashmir is a bilateral issue because Kashmir is a trilateral issue, because China occupies 1/5 of the original state of Jammu and Kashmir. But he made it clear that India-Pakistan issues for New Delhi are bilateral issues, and India would not like any other country to meddle in India-Pakistan issues. So the message was very clear. The signaling couldn't have been clearer. As far as Trump is concerned, as everybody knows, that at this moment, Trump is very eager to win Pakistan's cooperation in Afghanistan, given the fact that a US-Taliban deal seems imminent. It could be signed or at least unveiled any day. So he's really trying to pamper Pakistan. Trump is also ego-stroking Pakistan and its military generals and the Prime Minister there, Imran Khan. So given these realities, that is Trump, has offered at least twice in recent days to mediate the Kashmir conflict. But that has only unsettled the relationship between the US and India, and therefore his administration now realizes that it has to be very careful while speaking on this issue, because this issue has the potential to upset the US-India relationship.
Absolutely, indeed, because that, of course, is one of the ramifications. But, I would like to dwell a little bit more into what the logic of Donald Trump's offer actually is. Is there any reason at all that we could think of as to why Donald Trump had wanted to mediate on an issue that India has every single time in the last 7 decades stated is strictly a bilateral one?
It's a good question. If you look at this issue more broadly, Trump has a proclivity to offer to mediate in conflicts between different parties. He has offered to mediate between Japan and South Korea. He has offered to mediate between Russia and Europe. He has offered to mediate between various parties in different.
Professor Chellaney, I will have to interrupt you there. The Ministry of External Affairs is presently addressing the media. We're given to understand on this bilateral. Let's listen.
His meeting with the US President Donald Trump, and this was his last bilateral engagement at Biarritz, and Prime Minister will be shortly leaving for the return journey back to India. Let me begin with the meetings that were held yesterday. Prime Minister met the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Mr. Boris Johnson. That was a very good talk they had. It was focused on bilateral relations. President Johnson specifically spoke about the need to develop the partnership between the two countries, and he understood that it is important for access to be given for talented Indians to the United Kingdom, and he said he understood the value that talented Indians bring to the economy and society of Great Britain. The Prime Minister himself congratulated Prime Minister Johnson, said that this is a critical time when he is the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time of Brexit. The Prime Minister said that he stands by Prime Minister Johnson. We stand with Great Britain and we are ready to work with them once Brexit is over. The two Prime Ministers have agreed that a small team will be set up to progress the economic agenda. And therefore, the principal discussion that was held with Prime Minister Johnson focused on how, in the post-Brexit scenario, we can develop the partnership, we can strengthen economic and commercial relations. And what Prime Minister Johnson did say was that come 31st October, Britain would leave the European Union. So therefore, the decision that we will set up this small team to see how we can progress that relationship thereafter. There was some discussion that the two leaders had on the G7. Both agreed on the importance of working together in Africa. Boris Johnson mentioned the issue of climate change and environment, and Prime Minister conveyed to him that we are launching a national campaign against plastic waste in the oceans and against single-use plastic. That was welcomed by him. There was a brief discussion on the situation in the Gulf, on the need to find a new pathway if the JCPOA is not acceptable. And there was also some discussion on Afghanistan, where the two leaders agreed that there was an importance of gaining some clarity on what would happen if and when a deal is signed and announced between the United States and various Afghan groups. There was a brief meeting with the UN Secretary General. As you know, Prime Minister will be going to the United Nations General Assembly next month and participating as one of the keynote leaders and speakers in the UN Secretary General's Climate Change Summit or Climate Summit. Mr. Gutierrez mentioned that he is very enthusiastic about Prime Minister's leadership on climate change. Prime Minister himself spoke of the initiative on single-use plastic. He also took some time to explain his new initiative, which is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which we hope to launch during Prime Minister's visit to New York next month. And one of the ideas he spoke of in this regard was whether or not the world could come together to create a pool of trained volunteers in a global movement which would help countries recover after a disaster. This was one of the ideas that they spoke about. The Secretary General also expressed concern, of course, over India's thermal power plants in the context of climate change, and Prime Minister explained to him that India is moving towards renewable forms of energy, cleaner forms of energy. In this regard, the Prime Minister referred to nuclear power and said that this is an investment-intensive industry, that therefore the membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group is crucial to build investor confidence. And the UNSG said that he understood India's position in this regard and that he was willing to help out in this matter. So broadly, the discussions with UNSG focused on Prime Minister's forthcoming participation in the Climate Change Summit, as well as Prime Minister's own initiatives that he intended to take during the Climate Change Summit, including celebrating the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, at which the UN Secretary General will also be present in a special function. This morning, Prime Minister had a brief meeting with the President of Senegal. Senegal is a country which is important to us. We have had substantial bilateral relations with them. This was a bilateral meeting at which we discussed how we would develop further cooperation with the West African states, including in renewable energy. We have given 250 e-rickshaws or solar-powered rickshaws to Senegal. The President mentioned this in particular, and in fact told the Prime Minister that subsequent to the trials and tests, a very substantial order would soon be placed for these e-rickshaws. Prime Minister, of course, assured him of support in this as well as in other initiatives. And there was also a brief discussion on the International Solar Alliance. The President of Senegal has told Prime Minister that on all multilateral issues and in all international forums, Senegal stands shoulder to shoulder with India. Just before we came here, the meeting with President Trump has concluded. That was a substantially long meeting. There was, of course, a press conference, and all of you heard the press conference, so I will not go into the details of that, but subsequent to that, there was a 40-minute meeting, and it was principally focused on issues of trade and energy. The Prime Minister spoke of the importance of energy imports from the United States. He referred to the fact that $4 billion worth of imports were already in the pipeline and that we expected to step it up. As you know, Prime Minister will be visiting the United States next month. And in that context, he is going to have a roundtable with the top CEOs of energy companies and in Houston. And in that, the objective there is twofold. One, to see how we can import more energy from the United States. And the second is how we can invest in the energy sector in the United States, or rather how Indian companies can invest in the energy sector in the United States. This was welcomed by President Trump. In fact, President Trump spoke very warmly of the fact that India had become a major importer of energy. And he also indicated that he was willing to send top administration officials down to Houston for this purpose in an effort to ensure that the bilateral energy relationship is progressed. There was also thereafter some discussion on the trade issues. I won't go into details since all of you are aware of what these trade issues are. But as you know, when Prime Minister met President Trump in Osaka, Prime Minister had clearly conveyed that now that Prime Minister has been re-elected, that the election is behind him, that we are now in a forward-looking position on trade issues, and had offered to send our Commerce and Industry Minister, Shri Piyush Goyal, to Washington. That has not been able to materialize, perhaps because the United States was involved in other negotiations. But Prime Minister reiterated his offer, and he suggested that this was something which we can have a constructive approach to, that both sides should look at it afresh, and that we should move ahead. So essentially, the two leaders have agreed that preferably before Prime Minister's visit to Washington, there will be an interaction between the trade ministers at which we will discuss the whole range of trade issues. So essentially, that was the gist of the discussion. It was a very warm meeting, very positive meeting. It followed the discussions that Prime Minister had with President Trump on the telephone the week before. And this is the third either meeting or conversation that the two leaders have had in the about 100 days of office that the Prime Minister has been in his second term. So this was really the gist of the bilateral meetings. The G7 meetings are still on. Prime Minister is the keynote speaker at the moment on the digital initiative. He also spoke about India's initiatives on climate change and global warming. So we go back with a sense of satisfaction, both in the multilateral aspect of this visit and in the bilateral aspect of meetings in Washington, of Prime Minister's very successful visits to the United Arab Emirates and to the Kingdom of Bahrain, the latter for the first time that since independence that a Prime Minister has been there, and a very successful bilateral meeting with President Macron of France a couple of days ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are really running short of time. We have to leave for the airport, and therefore we can't take any questions. Thank you.
All right, so that was the press briefing by India's Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale there, stating that all these issues that had been in the air, there was a lot of anxiety in terms of what will in fact unfold at this bilateral meeting between US President Donald Trump and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as President Trump had made it abundantly clear that he wanted to negotiate, and during the bilateral meeting, the Indian Prime Minister made India's position clear that all issues with Pakistan will strictly remain bilateral. And Professor Bramha Chellaney continues to be with us on this broadcast. And Professor, if I can bring you in on this, we just heard Vijay Gokhale there stating that India has, of course, made its position amply clear to President Donald Trump. Will this be the last that we would hear of President Trump talking of wanting to negotiate or mediate on the issue of Kashmir?
I think while we focus on Kashmir, the Americans are focusing on trade and energy, as we heard from the Indian Foreign Secretary.
No, we'll talk about trade and energy in just a bit, Professor. You know, the issue that there was a lot of anxiety about was this offer that President Trump had been talking about quite regularly and repeatedly, that he would like to mediate between India and Pakistan. So do you think that this now puts an end to it?
Well, it will not put an end to Trump's tendency to rake up the Kashmir mediation offer. And this could, we could hear from him again about his willingness to mediate in the Kashmir conflict. But he can mediate in the Kashmir conflict only if India is willing. But India's consistent position under successive governments has been that India does not welcome third-party mediation. That stance has not changed under Prime Minister Modi. Mm-hmm. So the Americans might want to mediate in the Kashmir conflict, but the Indians certainly are not willing. But I think we need to pay attention to the American demands in the trade and energy areas, mm-hmm. because that's where the Americans are focusing their attention on. Absolutely. And that's where much of the bilateral today was focused on.
Indeed. So, what do you think will now happen in some of these contentious trade issues? Because President Trump has also time and again stated that India has in some ways benefited because of the lower tariffs that the United States has imposed on some of these Indian exports to the United States. Do you think the trade war that predominantly is playing out between the United States and China, the American president would now want to focus on India as well?
Well, Trump is also waging a trade war against India. It might be a mini trade war, mm-hmm. compared to the trade war that the U.S. is waging against China. But look at the actions that the Trump administration has already taken against India. It has expelled India from the U.S. GSP system. It has increased tariffs on 14.3% of India's exports to the U.S. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration has also increased India's energy import bill by preventing India from continuing to buy oil from Iran. The U.S. is seeking to supplant Iran as a major oil supplier to India, mm-hmm. but it's selling oil to India at a much higher price than Tehran. The Iranian oil was coming at concessional prices, while the American oil supply is at normal prices. So this means India is sinking hundreds of millions of dollars extra in buying oil from the United States. So we have had steel tariffs against India, CAATSA sanctions against India in relation to Indian arms imports from Russia. There are these Iran oil sanctions in place, the GSP termination, and then the recent setback on the Arms Export Control Act. There was a Sherman Amendment in the U.S. Congress to give India NATO equivalent status under the Arms Export Control Act. Mm-hmm. That amendment fell through, it collapsed. And therefore India is not getting that NATO equivalent status. So all these actions have happened in a matter of weeks. And they signify that the U.S. government led by President Trump is mounting pressure on India on trade and investment issues, and also threatening to initiate a Section 301 investigation against India if India does not make important concessions to the U.S.
All right, that's an interesting point that you've raised, and also the fact that, you know, the United States has been trying to, in some ways, arm twist India, virtually dictating in some issues as to what India should not do. Now, for instance, the United States was extremely unhappy that India was proceeding with its purchase of the S-400 missiles, but India has stuck to its guns. But in the case of purchasing oil from Iran, do you think India will still continue to go on and purchase oil with Iran, or will these sanctions now kick in?
Well, India's oil imports from Iran have come to zero now. And the U.S. said last month that it's highly gratified by India's cooperation on Iranian oil sanctions. The reality is it is one-sided gratification. The Americans are happy that India is obeying American sanctions, but in the process, the U.S. sanctions have raised India's oil import bill. And as I pointed out, the U.S., by seeking to replace Iran as a major oil supplier to India, it has ended up basically making India pay a higher price than what Tehran was charging, because Tehran's oil supply was coming at a lower price. So India is a net loser because of the U.S. oil sanctions against Iran.
All right, so those do remain some of the contentious issues between the India-US equation. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Chellaney, for joining us and getting us your insights. So the bilateral meeting between US President Donald Trump and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has ended. It, of course, was a packed schedule at the G7 summit in France. There were several bilaterals that were held on the sidelines of the summit, and amongst some of the main issues that was discussed with world leaders was also the tensions with Iran and trade. The US President Donald Trump and also Chancellor Angela Merkel a little while back had been at odds on Iran, while Trump said that the G7 members were united on Iran. Merkel said that they still had a long way to go. And also on the trade front, Donald Trump said that the United States has in fact reached a trade deal with Japan.
Back in the history of Japan-U.S. relations, never seen how...
You have to understand, he's a friend of mine, one of my closest friends. In this world, he's one of my closest friends. They send us millions and millions of cars. They have for many years. They're essentially not taxed. So they send them in from Japan. They're essentially not taxed. And my first step with Japan was to say, you have to move car companies into the United States. And they did. Many car companies are now operating plants in the United States and building plants in the United States, because we have had over the years a tremendous trade deficit with Japan.
However, not everything, of course, went smoothly for US President. World leaders, of course, began the climate session without US President. Remember, Donald Trump had withdrawn the United States from the Paris climate deal back in 2017.
Boris, order.